Joseph Smith Jr. was born in Sharon, Vermont on December 23, 1805. His parents were Lucky Mac Smith and her farmer and storekeeper husband, Joseph Smith Sr. In 1813, a typhoid epidemic in the region adversely affected the 7-year-old Smith Jr. and left him with an infection in the bone of his left leg. After the doctors tried to help the young boy's condition unsuccessfully, they recommended amputation of the infected leg so that the disease would not spread through the rest of his body. Little Joseph and his mother refused, and instead the doctor agreed to attempt an experimental surgery that he himself pioneered in order to try to extract the infected bone without sacrificing his leg. Luckily, the surgery was successful and the infection subsided. Young Joseph had to use crutches for the next few years, but eventually could walk on his own again. Joseph's father purchased merchandise for the store he ran from Boston-based creditors, and the community who shopped at his store purchased from him on credit, which was promised to be paid back to him come harvest season. Smith Sr. also tried to launch an expensive trade mission to China by giving a captain of a cargo ship crystallized ginseng root on consignment, hoping for a windfall of profits in return. However, the trade mission was a bust and he had nothing to show for it. What was even worse is several years of crop failures in the region have devastated his farm and business. In order to appease his creditors, Smith Sr. liquidates his land and assets, leaving him and his large family destitute. Eventually, the Smiths family settled down in New York State's village, Palmyra, taking a mortgage on a 100-acre farm. This area of western New York had plenty of religious fervor and zealotry at the time, and many religious revivals would take place in and around the village. The young Joseph, witnessing these public religious events, would consider his own beliefs and his eternal salvation. He took interest in Christianity as well as local folk magic as they appealed to the young man looking for his place in the universe. Many people in this community claimed visions, displayed spiritual gifts to others, and desired to break away from the orthodox beliefs of New England at the time. Having grown up in this type of environment influenced the young Joseph to claim his own visions later in life, as he sought to mimic the adults in his community and family who held clout and power over others, which he also grew to desire. In 1820, Smith Jr. claimed to have had a vision where God told him that his sins were forgiven, and all contemporary churches have turned aside from the gospel. Smith understood this to be a personal conversation and did not share it with very many people. 2 decades later, he used this story in the Mormon faith he imagineered as the first event that would restore the Church of Christ on planet Earth. In 1822, Junior's eldest brother Alvin began construction on a house on the family's mortgaged New York farmland. However, in November 1823, Alvin had a fever and died. The completion of the house was thus delayed. In 1824, for the first time in his entire life, Joseph Smith Jr. reads the entire Bible. For almost 6 years, Smith Jr. and Sr. gained a reputation for being treasure hunters who used scrying in order to obtain divination from seer stones in order to find treasure. Smith Jr. even told his family that he was led to a hill near the home where he found golden plates and an ancient breastplate, as well as 2 stones and silver bowls, but was prevented from taking the artifacts by a messenger of God in the form of an angel. While there is no record of the Smiths ever finding anything using their mystical techniques, in 1825, Josiah Stowell hired the Smiths and another seer to try to aid him in finding an old Spanish mine of precious metals near Harmony Township, Pennsylvania. Smith Jr. led Stowell on for a month, burying his head in his hat with a seer stone inside, claiming they were getting closer and closer to the treasure of the mine. However, after a month, he couldn't keep up this charade on forever, and told Stowell that enchantment of some sort was making it impossible for Smith to see the treasure anymore. Stowell abandoned the treasure hunt, but kept Smith Jr. working on other tasks until 1826. During his time working for Stowell, he started dicking down Emma Hale, the daughter of Isaac Hale, who he had been living with during the Stowell venture. In 1826, Smith Jr. was brought to Bainbridge, New York court for being a disorderly person and an imposter. The charges were brought by Stowell's nephew, who realized his uncle was being taken advantage of by this obvious con man. While this was a close call for the young con artist, luckily for him, Smith Jr. was, according to the trial note taker, discharged for lack of evidence. In November 1826, Smith Jr. left to Colesville, New York, where he made a tiny sum of $14 a month attempting to dig for treasure. In 1827, Emma Hale and Joseph Smith Jr. got married. Since 1823, when Smith Jr. mentioned finding the golden plates and artifacts that he could not retrieve, he is said to have gone back in an attempt to retrieve them 2 more times, once with a friend named Samuel Lawrence. In the end, he came up empty-handed every single time, and gave imagined divine excuses as reasons for his failures to retrieve what he had claimed he found, like the angels didn't let him have it this time, let's try next year. In 1827, with his wife, Smith Jr. went up to the hill one last time, where he claimed the plates and treasures to be. He left Emma waiting for him in prayer close to the hill, but far enough away where she could not witness him with an angel or the artifacts. Smith Jr. returned, claiming that this time he retrieved the plates successfully, but also says he right away hid them near the hill, so he did not have anything to show for his supposed success. This story, however, was enough to convince the rest of his treasure-seeking company that he did in fact unearth the artifacts that they believed they had an equal claim to, which would make them potentially very, very rich. Among these men was Samuel Lawrence, who Smith Jr. took with him to the hill just a year ago in an attempt to find the plates. These men decided to hire a seer in order to use divination to find the location of the artifacts Smith Jr. claimed to have unearthed. Smith Sr. hears about this and sends Emma to let his son know that his treasures are in danger of being taken. When Emma tells Smith Jr., he's not concerned, because he's well aware there's no treasure to be stolen to begin with. So he tells her not to worry because he determined through the relics are safe. Emma happily accepts this logic. Smith Jr. returned home to his parents' house and set out to bring back the re-hidden golden plates. Shortly thereafter, he comes back to his house with something wrapped in linen and with a dislocated thumb. He claimed to have fended off attackers who came after him after he retrieved the hidden plates, and that is how he came to be injured. Smith Jr. also forbade anyone from seeing the plates, even his own family. He had purchased a lockable chest and hid the plates inside it and under some floorboards of a small log home near his parents' main house. Smith's former treasure-seeking partners, however, found out about the location of the chest and ransacked the log cabin, finding it and breaking inside. Once again, their plans were foiled by the fact that there were never any artifacts to begin with, and there's nothing to be had inside the chest. Smith Jr. claims to his family after this event to have had the foresight to move the plates into a barrel of flax shortly before the break-in. Smith Jr. knew that he was in trouble with his former partners after him, and him not actually having anything of value. He decided to bank on his reputation, like when he got hired to be a seer. He contacted a wealthy man who he knew believed in his seer powers and also would have heard from the close-knit community of the rumors that he had in fact found the treasure. This man was a landowner named Martin Harris. Smith Jr. invited him to his parents' home and showed him a box in which he claimed were the plates, and told him the story about the divine ordering him to translate the plates from God. Immediately, Martin Harris bought the story hook, line, and sinker, never even having seen the plates, and gave Smith Jr. $50 to start translation. Smith Jr. was able to use this money to pay off his debts in town and leave to Harmony Township, Pennsylvania in early October 1827 with his wife. Once Joseph Smith Jr. and his wife arrived in Harmony Township, Pennsylvania, they went to stay with Joseph's wife's father, Isaac Hale. Isaac, having heard of Joseph's claims to have the golden plates in his possession, asks his new son-in-law to show him the artifact. Joseph shows Hale the box where they are kept, but refuses to open it and show him what is inside. Smith's refusal pisses Hale off, who now knows there's some sort of bullshit going on here that he wants no part of. Isaac Hale informs Smith he cannot allow in his house a box which he cannot look into, and Smith is forced to hide it outside. Hale quickly works on getting the newlyweds moved out of his house and into a new home he arranges to be placed on his 13-acre lot. In December 1827, Smith began translating the golden plates. His wife Emma and her brother Reuben helped in the translation, but were not allowed to see the plates. Smith would dictate to them while claiming to be examining the plates from behind a curtain. After a while, Smith claimed that he did not even need the physical presence of the plates for translation. He started dictating to Emma and her brother by simply burying his head in his hat. In February 1828, Smith's financial backer, Martin Harris, came to assist with the translation. Smith asked him to contact well-known scholars to see if any of them could authenticate the characters he claimed to have transcribed from the plates. Martin had no luck with getting educated scholars involved with the work of Smith's own imagination, and thus he came back in April unsuccessful. Smith had Harris act as a scribe, and he translated the plates to him. Sometimes, for convenience, Smith would even use his scrying stone to translate from, which was just bizarre. Even more bizarre was that Smith would sometimes even translate to Martin from other rooms because he claimed the Lord's presence was so great. By June, Smith imagineered 116 pages of translation from the golden plates. The translations thus far told about a great adventure of a man named Lehi from Jerusalem, whose descendant, King Benjamin, ended up in the Americas. Martin's wife Lucy was sick of her husband Harris wasting his money and energy on an obvious con man and his fairy tales. In an effort to convince her that what he was investing in was genuine, Martin convinced Smith to give him the only copy of the manuscript so that he could show it to her and a few other members of his family. Smith reluctantly agreed to let Martin take the manuscript after he signed a written oath to only show the pages to the few chosen family members he told Smith about. After Martin left, Smith's wife, Emma, gave birth to Smith's first child, but he was stillborn and deformed. Prior to the birth, Smith had publicly predicted that his baby, once born, would be able to see the plates and even aid Smith in their translation. To add insult to injury, his predictions were proven false. After his wife recovered from the birth, Smith traveled to Palmyra to find Harris to see why he had not come back yet with his pages. Once in Palmyra, Smith found out that Harris broke his promise to show the manuscript to a few people, and all sorts of people would come to view the pages at his house. What was worse is that Martin claimed that the pages from the manuscript had gone missing from the drawer he had kept them in. Smith despaired, but he used the opportunity to his advantage. He blamed Martin's loss of the pages for the death of his first child as a convenient way to get out of his falsely proven prediction about the role of the child. Smith knew that someone out there had the pages, and that if he was to attempt to translate them again, his translation would be different than the first, because he was making it all up as he went. If he published the new retranslation and the old one surfaces, he would be discredited and shown to be an imposter. When he came back to his wife, he needed to buy time to figure things out. He told her to write down a new revelation from the Lord that Smith dictated. In this new revelation, God rebukes Smith and Harris for losing the pages, but makes it clear that this was mostly the fault of Harris, and that Smith is still the chosen one, who the Lord will call upon soon for more divine work. Smith claimed that God would punish him by taking away his artifacts like the golden plates. However, on the 1-year anniversary of the date in which Smith originally claimed to have been given the plates by God, he had claimed to have received the plates again in order to begin the translation again. Thus, Smith began translating again with Emma, acting as a scribe.
He did not waste time pretending to translate from the plates anymore, but instead used a seer stone as it was the most convenient. When Smith's parents came to visit him, he told them that God revealed to him that his translation was going to be a marvelous work about to come forth among the children of men. As Smith continued translation, he had to take jobs outside of the home to support himself. But in March, Martin Harris returned from Harmony. He asked Smith if he could see the plates. Smith reluctantly agreed and said he would go to the woods where the plates were hidden, and after he came back, Harris could follow his tracks in the snow. Harris followed Smith's tracks, but was unable to find the plates because there were no plates to begin with. The next day, Smith brought a revelation he claimed was from God before Harris. Joseph claimed that God told him that there was no need to show anyone the plates, because if they don't already believe in the word of my servant Joseph and in the words translated from the plates, then they would never believe even if I showed them all things. Joseph Smith hoped this revelation would be enough to satisfy Harris for now. Joseph, however, added that God told him eventually 3 witnesses could see the plates and Harris could potentially be one of them. This part of the revelation he hoped would win Harris over by giving him hope of seeing the plates in the future. To try to get him to contribute money again, Joseph added that God asked him to stop the translation until he could secure funding for this process. Unfortunately, Harris was not too impressed with all this. In April, a school teacher, Oliver Cowdery, who had been staying with Joseph Smith Sr. in Vermont, who had heard of the golden plates from Smith's family, came to Harmony in hopes to act as a scribe for Joseph Smith Jr. Smith was overjoyed to have him assist, and with continued support of Joseph Knight Sr., translation began again. Soon after the collaboration started between Joseph and Oliver, Joseph Smith Jr. had a new revelation from God, that Oliver could also translate ancient hidden texts to test Oliver to see if he was on to the con. Oliver, however, did not just make stuff up like Smith, and instead was honest and said he was unable. Smith quickly reassured him his gift will have to wait till later, and Oliver went back to acting as a scribe. As Smith began contemplating working again on the 116 missing pages, he gave a new revelation from God. Smith said, whoever stole the 116 pages aimed to release them after Smith published his work to discredit him by showing the 2 translations were radically different. So God would give Smith a new ancient text called the Plate of Nephi to translate instead, which covered basically the same thing. Smith and Oliver claimed in May that an angel gave them the authority to baptize, and they baptized each other. Smith and Oliver were quickly getting through the translation, and their investor Martin Harris was once again excited in the venture. His wife, however, saw through their obvious con on her ancient senile husband. Harris's wife Lucy filed a criminal complaint against Smith for lying about having the golden plate artifact and committing fraud. Smith was tried in absentia, but when Martin Harris took the stand, the judge dismissed the case. As they neared the end of the translation, tensions rose in Harmony, and Smith and Oliver moved to Fayette, New York to finish translation. They stayed at a friend's of Oliver's, who gave them free room and board. During their move from Harmony, Smith claimed to have given the plates to an angel who acted as his personal divine FedEx and transported them to Fayette. He left his wife Emma behind in Harmony for the time being. Translation was almost completed around June. Smith at this time took Harris, Oliver, and David Whitmer, whose home in Fayette they were staying in, and had them all testify as witnesses that they all saw the plates in their spiritual eyes, whatever that means. Smith picked 8 more witnesses from his associates a few days later, who traveled to Palmyra, where Smith claimed the angels transported the plates to. They all testified that they saw gold-looking engraved metal plates. They all also signed an affidavit that was to be used by Smith at the end of the Book of Mormon to try to establish credibility for his stories. An unflattering article with a cover page from the Book of Mormon was written up in the Wayne Sentinel, and as Smith completed his translation in July, his notoriety grew. When Smith was ready to publish, he was turned down by many publishers, including E.B. Grandin from Palmyra. Eventually, however, E.F. Marshall from Rochester agreed to publish his book. In order to save travel time, Smith reapproached the local publisher that had originally turned him down with the Rochester offer in hand to try to persuade them to reconsider. With Martin Harris's farm as collateral, E.B. Grandin agreed to publish 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon for $3,000. The money was to be paid within 18 months from the time printing began. Half of the money was to be paid by Harris, and half was to be paid by Smith and his brother Hiram. An article in the Palmyra Freeman was published that negatively reported on Smith and his book. It was reprinted in other local newspapers. His book's title page was even satirized. At this time, Smith left the Harmony to be with his wife, leaving Oliver in charge of printing. He said God instructed Smith to keep the original manuscript and that Oliver should print from a copy. Smith also said that God instructed that Hiram, under guard, should bring only enough of the manuscript each day to the printer for the typeset. In January, Hiram and Oliver discovered another Palmyra newspaper, The Reflector, was publishing parts of the Book of Mormon. The newspaper operated out of the E.B. Grandin printing shop and refused to stop, so Hiram and Oliver sent for Smith. Smith returned and with the help of an arbitrator convinced them to stop because he had taken out a copyright on the book and they were now in violation of it. Smith again returned to be with his wife. In January, a group of Palmyra citizens started a boycott on the Book of Mormon and convinced E.B. Grandin to stop printing. Smith was unsuccessful in convincing his friends and family to secure his $1,500 end of the contract to pay for the printing, and Martin Harris was getting scared of being stuck with the entire $3,000 bill. Thus, he was considering reneging on his end of the agreement. Smith once again returned from Harmony to Palmyra. He convinced Martin Harris to stick to the plan by promising him in a written contract an equal privilege in selling the Book of Mormon until enough of them shall be sold for the printing of the same amount. Smith, with Harris again backing him, convinced E.B. Grandin to resume printing. Smith headed to Harmony to be with his wife. But later the same month, Martin Harris and his commitment started wavering yet again. As the first copies of the Book of Mormon were ready, Martin Harris had trouble selling them. Smith again left his wife to once again return to Palmyra, where he gave Harris a revelation from God, where God said, quote, "Impart portion of the property, ye, even part of thy lands, and all save the support of thy family, pay the printer's debt," end quote. Harris was convinced and agreed to pay the printing costs.
In 1829, Joseph Smith Jr. and his partner Oliver Cowdery began converting and baptizing people into their new Mormon faith, in anticipation of the soon-to-be published Book of Mormon. At this time, the church they were forming was known to its new adherents as the Church of Christ. In June, Joseph Smith Jr. had a brand new revelation from God, which commanded Oliver to build up my church and to find more stray sheep to adopt into the faith. Oliver Cowdery had after this claimed to have received his own new revelation from God. This revelation of his, known as the Articles of the Church of Christ, was God's orders for how he was to go about building up Joseph Smith's church, and this revelation gave him the new official title of Apostle of Jesus Christ. Smith sent Oliver to Canada shortly thereafter when he received yet another revelation from God telling him to sell the Book of Mormon's Canadian copyright for $8,000. Oliver and those accompanying him on the mission, however, failed to secure the obscene amount of money Smith told them to ask for, and the mission was a bust. Upon their return, the group was rightfully suspicious of Smith's revelation to go to Canada. Why would God send them on a mission he knew was destined for failure? Smith, however, won back their faith through another convenient divine revelation, saying, "Some revelations are of God, some revelations are of men, and some revelations are of the devil." After this, Joseph Smith never used the seer stone again to make revelations from God, and relied solely on what he claimed was the presence of the Holy Spirit. This tactic was to work to blame the seer stone for sending the revelation from the wrong source. After the publication of the Book of Mormon, Smith claimed that God revealed to him that he is a seer, a translator, a prophet, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and an elder of the church. Not just any elder, but he was the first elder of the church. And Oliver Cowdery was the first preacher of the church. On April 11, 1830, the Church of Christ, led by Joseph Smith Jr. and based on his translation of the secret, unrevealable artifact known as the Golden Plates, held its first official gathering in Fayette, New York. There were quite a few baptisms in this first meeting, soon thereafter followed by rebaptisms of some who were already baptized, followed by an exorcism and another following meeting in Colesville, New York. The exorcism was performed on Joseph Knight Sr.'s son and led to the growth of Smith's notoriety. Smith dictated a new vision of Moses that was to be kept secret between only his believers. In this vision, Moses was tempted by Satan when he tried to convince him he was actually Jesus. Joseph Smith also said he recently saw the angel Michael, who upon further inspection turned out to be the devil. As Joseph Smith continued to baptize in Colesville, a great animosity grew towards him, his followers, and for their beliefs and their practices like the exorcism. Based on Joseph Smith's activities in Colesville, a local constable arrested him and charged him with being a disorderly person. Smith faced a 2-day trial in South Bainbridge, New York, but was acquitted with the help of 2 attorneys Joseph Knight hired to defend him. As soon as he was released, he was immediately rearrested and faced another trial in Colesville, and once again he was acquitted. Joseph at this point had set up branches of his church in Manchester, Colesville, and Fayette, New York, and these centers of power gave him money and support for his endeavors. To further his financial gain from his new flock, in August, he revealed that God told him that it was not safe to buy alcohol from those outside the church, and that his followers should only buy alcohol from other followers. Smith also wanted to concentrate all the new power under himself, and made a new revelation to Oliver from God, which said Joseph Smith Jr. alone received revelations from God. Soon, Oliver would be sent far away by Smith on conversion missions to the Lamanites, which is what Smith called Native Americans. Right before the second conference of Smith's church, Smith revealed that at some point God's elect would all gather in one location on the face of the earth to await Armageddon. On September 26, 1830, the second conference of Smith's church was held. Smith had the revelations of others denounced as false and called upon new proselytizing missionaries to grow his power. After the second conference of the church, Oliver Cowdery left his proselytizing mission to the Native Americans west of the Mississippi, accompanied by Parley Pratt, a recent convert. As they traveled to their destination during a brief stay in Kirtland, Ohio, they converted a minister, Sidney Rigdon, and a large amount of his congregation to Smith's new faith. Rigdon traveled to meet Smith in Fayette, New York, and Joseph Smith was impressed with his new surprise convert. In fact, so much so that he had a new revelation comparing Rigdon with John the Baptist. Joseph had Rigdon act as his new scribe and revealed that with Rigdon's help, they could translate the sealed mysteries of God. They would start this glorious undertaking by translating the super secret hidden metaphysical book called The Prophecy of Enoch, but soon postponed the project. In December 1830, Smith moved the church headquarters from Fayette, New York to Kirtland, Ohio, based on a revelation. He also ordered Cowdery to return from his failed proselytizing mission to the Native Americans. Smith thus escaped the persecution he was facing in New York and Pennsylvania, and many of his followers moved with him, settling in Kirtland, Ohio and Jackson County, Missouri, where Smith claimed God instructed him to build the New Zion. Smith was not, however, able to avoid persecution for long. In Ohio, his notoriety followed him. local sentiment grew against him and his followers. Local vigilante militias took up violent rebellion to the Mormons, who sought to build their new Zion on top of them. Many Mormon homes were burnt, and so was a church print shop set up by Smith. Joseph Smith himself was attacked in 1832. A mob broke into his house and forced him, his wife Emma, and an adopted child of theirs from their home. His wife was threatened with murder and rape, while Smith was stripped, beaten, tarred and feathered, and left for dead. While Smith survived the assault, his adopted child died from exposure 5 days after the incident. In 1834, Smith raised a militia of his own, known as the Camp of Zion, and numbering 200 strong in Kirtland, Ohio. They were to travel to Jackson County, Missouri to take back Zion, and they were accompanied by women and children. The soldiers left on May 4th and traveled through Indiana to reach Missouri a month later. Many of them contracted cholera on the journey and were sick, and Jackson County residents tried to negotiate with the Mormons to resettle nonviolently. While Jackson County negotiations fell through and the Camp of Zion forces were disbanded before any real conflict took place, Missouri did agree to give Smith his own brand new county of Caldwell for Mormon settlement in 1836. The formation of the militia radicalized and militarized the Mormons who participated in it, and Smith welcomed back his faithful soldiers by organizing the Quorum of 12 Apostles and the First Quorum of 70, filling its ranks with Camp of Zion members. In 1836, Smith's church's first temple was built in Kirtland, Ohio. In 1837, Smith tried his hand at banking and failed. He and some of his associates were accused of unethical banking practices when a bank without an official Ohio bank charter, but instead a charter held by Smith, collapsed. Seeing the legal mess he was in, the writing on the wall was clear. Smith was not safe in Ohio, and thus left to his new county in Missouri. In 1838, Joseph Smith and the rest of his followers from Kirtland, Ohio, came to live in Missouri. Smith claimed that part of western Missouri was to be the very center of the New Zion. The New Zion being where Joseph Smith claimed the second coming of Jesus Christ would take place. Latter-day Saints have been settling in Missouri for the last 7 years, so the territory was already well established by the time Joseph and the last of the Mormons showed up. Quickly, the tensions between the Latter-day Saints and the Missourians got hot. Mormons purchased a lot of land and thus quickly gained voting political power. Joseph Smith poured gasoline on that fire by claiming publicly God himself promised to him that Jackson County, Missouri would be his new Jerusalem. Jackson County was to be Smith's personal domain. Physical violence broke out, and mobs of Missourians tarred and feathered 2 Mormons. As many as 800 Latter-day Saints lost their homes and businesses following Missouri's anti-Mormon ruling. The Mormons made legal appeals through the U.S. court system, and Joseph Smith Jr. himself even met with President Martin Van Buren in Washington, D.C. However, none of this helped, and finally, Congress itself sent the issue back to Missouri. In response to the violence and lack of federal protection, the Mormons started a new militia called the Denites, whose leader was Dr. Samson Havard. Thus, the 1838 Mormon War had begun. The Denites attacked non-Mormons in Caldwell County, sacked Gallatin, attacked ex-Mormons, and pillaged their property, as well as planned to burn down the cities of Richmond and Liberty. At the most pivotal point in the war, there was the Battle of Crooked River. Missouri state troops and the Denites exchanged fire. The Mormons rushed the position of the state troops, which made them flee, and at the end, 3 Denites and 1 state trooper lay dead. Also, an injured Missourian by the name of Samuel Tarwater was mutilated by the Mormons using a sword to slice his face and was left for dead. Fearing the Mormon insurrection, on October 27, 1838, the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, issued the infamous Missouri Executive Order 44. The order stated that because the Mormons are in open rebellion to the laws of the state, they must be exterminated or driven out of Missouri. Absurdly, this order would stay in effect until 1976. Following the extermination order, Missourians killed 17 Mormons at the Haun's Mill Massacre. 2,500 state militia troops attacked the Mormon headquarters at the settlement known as the Far West. Facing an overwhelming force, Joseph Smith and the other Latter-day Saints surrendered. Joseph Smith Jr. was charged with treason. Holding a military tribunal following an immediate execution of Joseph Smith was considered. However, General Alexander William Doniphan argued for the due process, and the military tribunal was never carried out so that a fair trial could be held instead. Joseph Smith was transferred to a Missouri jail in Liberty and awaited his trial. Smith, having always gotten out of legal trouble in the past, endured his imprisonment with a positive attitude. On April 6, 1838, Joseph Smith and some of his allies were due for trial in Davis County, Missouri. However, they escaped by getting the guards drunk while being transferred from the jail. This escape was carried out in collaboration with Hiram, Joseph Smith's brother, who was on the outside. Governor Lilburn Boggs and his Order 44 succeeded. Joseph Smith and almost all the Mormons were forced out by 1839 from the state of Missouri. They left behind the land Joseph Smith said God had promised to them. Their New Jerusalem, their Zion, where the second coming of Jesus Christ had been prophesied. After the violent exodus of the Mormons from Missouri, Joseph Smith Jr. and his followers settled on the banks of the Mississippi River. Joseph established a new area for Mormon occupation here in Hancock County, Illinois. He called this land Nauvoo, which he falsely associated with a Hebrew word for beautiful. This beautiful place was in fact a soggy mosquito breeding ground. Soon a malaria plague swept the Latter-day Saints settlement. Some of those killed by the pestilence included the son and brother of Joseph Smith, both of whom were named Don Carlos, and who died within a few days of each other. The very same year, Smith made a trip to Washington, D.C. to once again meet with President Martin Van Buren. This time, Smith wanted reparations from the federal government for what happened to the Mormons in Missouri. He also threw shade on Missouri and their oppressive regime. His claims even got out to the national press. However, despite his efforts, the election was coming up, and Martin Van Buren did not care to rock the boat with Missouri, so no reparations were ever paid. Joseph Smith, with one cunning move, now reestablished his sole dominance over his followers and expanded his evangelism overseas. While Joseph Smith was imprisoned, Brigham Young took up as temporary leader, and the Saints obeyed him implicitly. In some ways, this challenged Smith's ultimate authority. Brigham was a senior member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and thus Smith had the Quorum leave to proselytize on a trip to England. Now his leadership was completely without contest, and his gamble paid off, as the poor English population was very receptive to the Mormon message. The new European converts started venturing across the ocean to join Smith in Nauvoo. The state of Illinois was much more welcoming to the Mormons and their prophet than were prior states. Two speculators from Connecticut gave the Saints enough credit to purchase their new land, and in February of 1841, Nauvoo, having been well established, received a charter from the state of Illinois. With this newfound political autonomy, Joseph Smith committed to a grand idea of building a brand new Mormon city on these lands. Smith wanted to create a metropolis, complete with municipal courts, industrial projects, a university, a hotel, as well as a militia, which was to be known as the Nauvoo Legion. However, even before the charter was issued, Smith had already started building a Mormon temple in autumn of 1840. Doctrines of the Mormon faith had started changing during this time. 5 years prior to Smith's occupation of the Nauvoo land in 1835, Smith raised thousands of dollars from his congregation to purchase Egyptian scrolls complete with mummies from a traveling antiquity show. He translated one of those scrolls, even though no one else could translate Egyptian at that time, and claimed the scroll was the Book of Abraham, publishing it in Nauvoo in 1840. This tale of the forefather from the Judeo-Christian faiths claimed that there was in fact a plurality of gods, and that the earth was constructed from matter that had existed before it. Later, the exact scroll he had translated would fall into the hands of legitimate Egyptologists, and it had in actuality had absolutely nothing to do with Abraham or any of the other meanings Joseph Smith Jr. attributed to it, but instead was fragments from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, having largely to do with rituals dealing with the deceased in the times of the pharaohs. His translation was without a doubt a well-documented fraud, and most likely came directly from Smith's mind's own imagination. Some other teachings Smith added to Mormonism at this time were the ideas that matter, not God, was eternal, that God had developed through time and space and used matter as well as the spirits which he drew from the pool of eternal intelligence to make all things that now exist. Smith's most controversial new doctrines included the baptism of the dead. This was his way of recruiting those to the Mormon faith who were no longer among the living, and he hoped one day to join all of humanity in Mormon solidarity, every generation from start to finish. The state of Missouri wished to extradite Smith so he could face charges from the Mormon War. They, however, failed in a technicality. Illinois, too, became a less welcoming place, and Smith was opposed by a newspaper known as the Warsaw Signal. Smith's sexual appetites grew at this time as well, and he ended up promoting the idea of plural marriage, especially for himself. He ended up marrying around 30 women, at least 10 of which were already married. He convinced them and their fathers by promising the unions would bring them honor and exalt them, that their families would be spiritually linked to the prophet, and their entire households would be given salvation and immortality. Also adding that him and his wives would eternally procreate in heaven, and thus themselves become gods after death. Many of his wives were teenagers, and 2 were just 14 years of age. Needless to say, his original wife Emma, who Smith had grown bored with, hated this new doctrine her husband embraced. Ashamed, even after Smith's death, she would deny the fact that he was ever a polygamist. Smith tried at first to keep his plural marriages a secret, but as more and more of his followers got involved, the more his secret became known. Making things even worse, one of Smith's own followers, John Cook Bennett, used Smith's teaching of plural marriage just to get laid, as he fooled women with Smith's revelation, telling them that the saints had a policy of allowing fornication if it was kept on the down low. Bennett also scandalously abandoned his prior wife and 2 children before becoming a Mormon. Since Bennett was the first mayor of Nauvoo, the major general of the Nauvoo Legion, the assistant president, and who Smith predicted to be a great blessing to the Mormon community, he slayed plenty of pussy. With mounting pressure, Smith forced Bennett to resign. On May 16, 1842, the New York Herald reported on the rumors of Nauvoo's sexual excess. John Cook Bennett, in retaliation for Smith ousting him out of his position of power and being an opportunist, also published exposés on the life at Nauvoo in different newspapers that would even later be compiled into a book. Anti-Mormon sentiment rose, but at this time Smith was in charge as the Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, which was 2,000 men strong and kept him safe. This military force, however, was a double-edged sword, because it also made him look like a huge threat,
as the Legion was a quarter of the size of the entire US Army of those times. Missouri was scared that now with so much power at Smith's disposal, he may come to violently claim the reparations he had once already petitioned for. On May 6, 1842, just 10 days before the damning article on the Nauvoo Mormons, which was published by the New York Herald, the governor of Missouri, who passed the infamous Executive Order 44 and called for the eradication of Mormons, was assassinated by an unknown assailant who had shot him 3 times in the head. Doctors expected Governor Boggs to die very shortly, and some newspapers even published his obituary. However, Governor Boggs did not die, and once he recovered, he demanded that Smith be extradited for the attempted assassination. From that point on, until a Springfield court ruled the extradition unconstitutional, Joseph Smith Jr. went into hiding. Smith's personal bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, was rumored to be the gunman, and Smith himself prophesied Boggs would die a violent death, which was yet another false prediction. Illinois at this point considered revoking Nauvoo's charter. In response, Smith petitioned Congress to upgrade Nauvoo to territory in an attempt to keep his power. Congress obviously denied his petition. In June of 1843, Smith was indicted by a Missouri grand jury. Joseph H. Reynolds was dispatched by the governor of Illinois to apprehend Smith. On June 21st, Sheriff Reynolds arrested Joseph Smith, and subsequently himself was arrested by Sheriff Campbell of Lee County. Smith, Reynolds, and an aide of Reynolds, Constable Harmon T. Wilson, were transported by Sheriff Campbell to the Municipal Court of Nauvoo, where Smith was on his home turf and unsurprisingly was promptly freed after his warrant was dismissed. With the 1844 election nearing, Smith wrote to the popular candidates to ask how they would protect the Mormons. After getting responses that were not satisfactory, Joseph Smith Jr. made the outrageous decision to run for the President of the United States. He had a quorum of 12 apostles and hundreds of other religious missionaries under his control proselytized for him politically. His running mate was to be his subordinate, Sidney Rigdon. Smith's campaign for the highest office in the land ran on a promise of freeing the slaves by selling public land, the reestablishment of a national bank, closing prisons, and annexing Texas, Oregon, and parts of Canada. Smith, making plenty of enemies, ran as a third-party candidate, directly challenging the 2 establishment parties of the time, the Whigs and the Democrats. Smith also made plans to make a new Mormon settlement in Oregon or California. Finally, Smith made a shadow government known as the Council of 50 that was run by Smith under the political ideas he called a theodemocracy. The council ordained Smith the King of the Kingdom of God. It also sent ambassadors to England, France, Russia, and the Republic of Texas. Smith was convinced that within a few years the United States would collapse. Most Illinois residents at this time were no longer welcoming to the Mormons and instead wanted them gone from the state, growing tired of Smith's meddling in politics. Also, a large part of Smith's own people came to oppose him. One of his followers who defected was William Law, who was Smith's second counselor in the first presidency and held much clout among the Mormons. Law purchased a printing press and with others made testimonies at the county seat in Carthage that ended up bringing about 3 indictments against Smith. Law's biggest beef with Smith was that he dared proposition Law's own wife to join his marital gaggle. Smith tried to defend himself from these accusations of polygamy and spoke to a large crowd of saints on May 26th of 1844 and claimed that he had only one wife. Hard at work at his printing press, on June 7th, Law published his first and only edition of his newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor. In it were affidavits where claims that some had heard Smith make revelations giving every man the privilege of marrying 10 virgins. Also, the Nauvoo Expositor accused Smith of creating false doctrine, rejecting Smith's revelations of polytheism.
Smith did not take well to criticism and had his Nauvoo City Council pass a libels ordinance for the purpose of censorship. Then Joseph Smith Jr., being the mayor of Nauvoo himself, ordered the city's marshal to destroy the expositor. The marshal dragged the press, type, and newspapers onto the street where they were publicly burned. The residents of Illinois were deeply enraged by the latest obscenity perpetrated by Smith. The suppression of the free press gave strength to law's claim of a corrupt Mormon leader. Tensions rose to a boiling point. Soon the newspaper named the Warsaw Signal, run by Smith's enemy, Thomas C. Sharp, reported of Smith's use of censorship and his destruction of the expositor. Inside Sharp's report was a call to action.
Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time to comment. Every man will make his own. Let it be with powder and ball.
On June 18th, Joseph Smith declared martial law in Nauvoo. This mobilized the Nauvoo Legion to defend against any possible upcoming anti-Mormon attacks. Thomas Ford, the governor of Illinois, offered Smith protection under the condition he faced trial at Carthage. Smith disarmed the Legion, but at the last minute had fled to Iowa. Many of his followers perceived this as cowardice. Upon hearing of how his actions have tarnished Smith's reputation, he returned to Illinois and was arrested on June 23rd. Smith and 3 other Mormons were imprisoned in a Carthage jail, and his hearings at court began. Smith's friends managed to sneak pistols into the jail for him that he kept for self-defense or possible escape. On June 27, 1844, an armed mob of men in blackened faces attacked the jail. Hiram, one of the Mormons in jail with Smith, was shot in the face. Smith fired 6 shots and wounded 3 of his attackers. He tried to escape from a window of his cell, which had no bars but was in the 2nd story, but got shot and ended up falling. Once in the ground, he was still alive. However, 4 men from the mob quickly ran up to him and fired more rounds into him, ensuring his death. Residents of Carthage abandoned their town, fearing Mormon reprisal, but the Mormons had no fight left in them. To ensure Joseph Smith Jr.'s and Hiram's graves were not defiled, they were buried in a basement of an unfinished house. In their public funeral, their coffins were simply filled with sand. 5 men stood trial in 1845 for the murder of Hiram and Smith. However, they were not convicted. Their defense argued that they were carrying out the will of the people, and enough members of the jury, which consisted of both Mormons and non-Mormons, found this explanation acceptable. The defendants were ultimately acquitted of all charges. Thus ends the biography of Joseph Smith Jr., but not the story of his new theology. I would like to thank the Drunken Philosopher, who is gracious enough to lend a hand in this project by being the voice of Thomas C. Sharp. If you love getting buzzed and philosophizing, check out his YouTube, linked in the description below. If you would like to see more of my documentaries, please subscribe and check out my YouTube channel. If you would like to help me fund these documentaries, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/trustyoursources. Your support will make this channel thrive, and I thank you all for it. This has been a production of your trusted source, and I wish you all the love.